The red flag for narcissism in leadership is when you start identifying with what Jung called your capital S self, the Godhead inside you, whatever it is.
But they're very polarizing, and then
Yes.
other people are paying the price for what is not really leadership for the good of the whole.
They get stuff done. They're popular. They're kind of sketchy, bad people in retrospect too. It's always a mixed blessing with narcissism. I mean, 30 years ago, we didn't take pictures of ourselves and share them with our friends. And if we did, people would think that was insane.
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Dr. W. Keith Campbell, a professor at the University of Georgia and one of the world's leading experts on the topic of narcissism. Keith Campbell, what do you think a narcissist wants in a leadership role?
Well, leadership is attractive to somebody who's narcissistic because it gives them an opportunity to have social status, power, control over individuals, and the opportunity to sort of inflate their ego as needed. So it's a societal position where you're able to get your ego needs met more easily than if you're a follower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a quote from your book, for narcissistic leaders, moments of turbulence provide perfect opportunities to rise in fame, wealth, or sexual access.
Yes.
Have you ever seen a more turbulent time in your life?
Oh, no, this is, we've been predicting this fourth turning for a lot of years, and we're right in the thick of the beast right now, and it's real tough. So yeah, we're in turbulent times. The reason I said that is that there's a control strategy that people use. I call it a billfish or swordfish strategy. I don't think it's ever been published that way. But essentially what you do is you create a bunch of turbulence and chaos in the system. It makes people confused, they can't really ground themselves. They don't know what's up or down, and that makes them easy to control. The same way a swordfish, when it eats, it comes into a school of fish, shakes its bill around a bunch, gets all the fish all crazy, and just picks them off. So that kind of technique of destabilization is a good way to create shifts and change in a system. Is a leader. You can think about it even as like a complex system. You've got a water that's still, but if you make it all turbulent, it's really easy to move around in it. And that's what you're doing. You're destabilizing things so you can move them the way you want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Keith, you said this fourth turning. I've heard that phrase. I've even read a book by the title. But what do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. That I don't know how common that is. So back in the day, two gentlemen, Strauss and Howe, wrote a book on generations. I think this was early 90s. It's a wonderful book. And I read it, and my friend Gene Twenge read it, which is, we talked and we started studying generations when we were doing our postdocs. But part of this book argued that generations worked in these series of a 4-part cycle. There's sort of 4 turnings. And the end of those 4 turnings is a very chaotic and destabilized time. Often there's war, maybe civil war. And then the system sort of resets into a new stabilized system and it starts again. So you might think of, coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, there's a lot of chaos in the country. It restabilized in the U.S. in the 40s and the 50s were super stable. And then, the theory kind of works where it's almost like a seasonal theory, spring, summer, winter, fall. And we're right now in the winter of the system. And once we get through this, this kind of time of darkness and recalibration, will reset for a new kind of emerging spring. That's the theory.
Let's hope so.
So yeah, and I got to say, they really nailed it. They really nailed it. I argued against it. I thought that narcissism would just keep going up and up and up, and I could see a really easy way for that to happen, but it didn't work that way, and it really seems to be turning.
What do you mean the narcissism was going up and it seems to be turning? There's population studies?
So back, God, this is almost 20 years, maybe 15 years. Gene and I were looking at narcissism Gene Twenge and I were looking at narcissism when social media came out. Right. This is very early social media. And what we saw was this trend where narcissism was increased. This is in college students because it's the only people really have data for. Individual narcissism scores were going up and up. I thought what would happen was they would just keep going, that we would go into kind of a Ready Player One world where, we'd move people online to get status. And what instead seemed to happen is that narcissism sort of peaked in the great financial crisis, and it really started going down at the individual level since then. So college students today don't look as narcissistic to me as they did in, 2006 or something.
That is so surprising because people talk so often. I mean, part of the reason your topic is so big in culture, I think, is because there is this sense that it is rising and rising and rising. You've seen it turn down in college students.
Yeah.
Do you see it turning down in culture more broadly?
I think this is where it gets complicated. There's a couple things you can look at. One is you can look at what is the personality makeup on average of the individuals in the society. Are they sort of self-centered? Are they confident? Do they have high self-esteem? Are they attention-seeking? And you can also ask the question, is culture narcissistic? And that does culture promote self-centeredness, self-promotion, attention-seeking, etc., fame, whatever? Right now, we're living in a very narcissistic culture, meaning our culture pulls for a lot of these things like attention-seeking, status, etc., but the individuals themselves don't seem to be as narcissistic, at least the young people. They seem to be very anxious right now. And that seems to be a change. I just telling you what I look at the data, and it's kind of what it looks like to me.
Mm-hmm. So being anxious would be counter to being narcissistic. On our topic of narcissists in leadership, I mean, what are the characteristics of that narcissistic person?
I'll make this gets a little more complicated and you're asking these questions and there's a lot I could unpack here. But when we're talking about narcissism, we're talking about a couple different forms or styles of narcissism. And what most people are familiar with is what we call grandiose narcissism. It's the more extroverted, ambitious, self-confident, interested in fame, attractiveness, social status, celebrity, politician, mega pastor, the whole deal, podcasters, the whole, professors. That's kind of the narcissism we're used to. That's what most normal people think about. Another form of narcissism is the individuals who have this sort of same sense of entitlement. The world owes me a favor. I'm a big deal, but they don't really manifest it well. They're a little insecure. They're not really extroverted. They're not really energetic. And so what happens is they build up a fantasy of like, I'm really important. And in their fantasy, they fantasize about fame, but they don't do so much except when people criticize them, they can be reactive. And often, so we call that more vulnerable. I need to say that word, vulnerable narcissist or covert narcissism, hidden narcissism or basement narcissism. So there are these two different kind of aspects of narcissism people have talked about for 75 years. And what's going on right now is the young people seem more anxious, more depressed, more insecure, which looks a lot more vulnerable to me. But I don't have any data that vulnerable narcissism is increasing, although I suspect it might be. But grandiose narcissism with confidence and self-esteem is dropping.
Okay.
In young
people.
people.
In the Big Five model, what are the traits that are associated with narcissism?
Good question. Yeah. So as personality psychologists, we have a general model of personality we use, which is supposed to sort of be a general map of kind of capture most of personality called the Big Five. And the 5 traits spell ocean, which are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. the way narcissism seems to work in sort of the big five recipe is the core is low agreeableness, what we might call antagonism, a sense of entitlement, a sense of self-importance, a sense of superiority. I'm better than other people. They're beneath me. That's kind of the core. And then if you take that self-centeredness and marry it with extroversion, which is assertiveness, sociability, confidence, energy, positive emotionality. If you fuse those two things, you end up with what's called grandiose narcissism. So in a way, it's like taking a sort of a socially negative trait and mixing it with a socially positive trait. That's what makes it really a difficult and challenging thing, and also makes it a trait you can get successful with. If you take that same antagonism, self-centeredness, and then marry that or associate that with neuroticism, sort of I'm neurotic, I'm anxious, I'm a little depressed, I'm not really sure who I am, I'm easily overwhelmed by events, and I think I'm a big deal and people should pay attention to me and I'm really important, that's where you get this vulnerable narcissism, this more defensive kind of narcissistic structure. And that vulnerable type they're not running the show. They're not becoming leaders. They're not becoming politicians. They're kind of sitting at home on the internet getting mad at people more.
Okay. So that anxious, neurotic dimension does not determine whether or not someone is narcissistic. It's just a different flavor.
It's the flavor of the vulnerability and vulnerable narcissism. Neuroticism is core to a lot of suffering and a lot of more mental challenges or mental disorders. So you see a lot of neuroticism and anxiety disorders, substance abuse disorders, depressive disorders, and the same with vulnerable narcissism. It's like the more depressive, anxious form of narcissism.
Okay.
And just to make it complicated, both of these things we're talking about are personality traits, meaning that we're all kind of on the, somewhere on there. Most people are in the middle. There's also a psychiatric or clinical disorder called narcissistic personality disorder, which is grandiose, but also has some vulnerability and is really just the extreme form of narcissism. The same way, I can be depressed, but it might not be clinical depression unless it gets really extreme. That's the same with narcissism.
You think it's the extreme. So if there was a scale and you're just pushing up higher and higher and higher in trait narcissism, eventually you cross a threshold into pathological clinical narcissism?
It's the extremity plus the flexibility. So if you're really high in narcissism, but you can turn it down when you need to, like when you're meeting the king who's going to chop your head off if you're rude to him, that's okay. But if you can't turn it down, that's the problem. But to be a disorder, it has to lead to clinically significant impairment, meaning it has to mess your life up to be a disorder. It can't just be like, hey, I think I'm a legend and nothing bad happens. You're like, well, that's okay. The usual problems with narcissism are your relationships suffer. So you end up with damaged marriage, or problems at workplace. So it could be taking big risks that are kind of silly at work to get attention, do an acquisition that looks really good and gets you in the papers, but it's a bad mistake. So it can be risk-taking. It can be dishonesty. That can get you in trouble, lying, cheating at work. So there's impairment that goes with narcissism.
Mm-hmm. So with a narcissistic leader in general, what are some of their shortcomings? The
shortcomings are primarily going to be in the world of ethics. So you think about a leadership role and you're really narcissistic and you come to a decision point where do I do decision A that benefits me and maybe hurts everybody else, or do I do decision B that benefits everybody else that's my followers, but maybe I take the hit? The narcissistic leaders tend to benefit themselves. So they tend to be corrupt.
Wow. I mean, that's the last person that you want in a leadership role, and someone who is corrupt.
It's really complicated because what happens when you look at leaders is if it's your leader and they're kind of corrupt, but they're aggressive against the other side, you still like them. But if you're the other guy's leader, you really hate them. So imagine, I'm in a football town. Imagine we had a tackle or something. I don't mean football players are good guys. They work real hard. But you imagine you had this really aggressive football player and maybe he cheated a little bit and, but he won a lot. Yeah, people are going to tolerate that if it's winning. They don't tolerate it when it's losing. So it gets complicated with leadership. You'll put up with some dishonesty in a leader if you think they're doing a good job for you.
Right. Yeah, I used to be in the Navy, and so I would see this in the organization, and it would even break down. Somebody might be a department head, so the competition could be still within the organization, so to speak, but they'd be competing for resources, time, that kind of thing. And so the people who were under them would love them, but they'd be very polarizing. Other people would hate that guy, and because he would actually be bringing the whole down. But taking care of something that was more relevant to his personal needs.
That's funny. I literally just read a dissertation on this topic last week. But yeah, it's really interesting, that example you're giving, because you're talking about a boss that maybe has like a preferred employee under them that they're like bringing along with them to take, that maybe they're henchmen or something that's doing things for them or breaking rules for them. And they'll carry them up, kind of ride their coattails up through the system. So the corruption sort of follows its way up. It's gross. I try to tell people, look at the world's leadership. It's just not the U.S. Look at our Congress. And I got politicians all around here. I like them. They're nice folks. I'm not like anti-politicians. But you look at our political leaders, look at Europe, look at the world. And you're like, how did we pick these people? Like, are these really the best of the best? Like, are these the guys you would... And no one really thinks that. And you go, why are they being selected for? Well, a lot of people are being selected because they're corrupt. That's the test. You got to be corrupted to get the leadership job because they want to make sure you're not going to rat out who's ever stealing whatever they're stealing. So you end up with a little bit of a corruption filter in a lot of leadership, unfortunately.
That's a phrase, a corruption filter. I mean,
I just made that one up, but that's a good one. It is a corruption filter, and if you're not willing to be corrupt, they kind of don't want you around because you might tell on people.
Wow. Yeah. And Keith, you said you just read a dissertation on the topic. What was the finding?
I can't talk about it, unfortunately. I mean, for real, because it hasn't passed yet.
Got it.
Sorry.
No problem.
I just thought it was interesting that you're bringing that up. So people in the academic world are studying these things.
Okay, great. Yeah. Related, another quote from your book: narcissistic leadership thrives in a hierarchy. So what is it about structure that also makes it so effective?
It's very much about status. So, humans are really neat because we kind of have these big hierarchies, but we also have kind of flat hierarchies. And if you have a really kind of I don't know what the right word is, a tall hierarchy, a multi-layered hierarchy, that gives you a chance to move up and up to get higher and higher status. So somebody who's narcissistic is like, wow, there's a mountain of status I can climb and get on the top of, and that's going to be really appealing to me. If I'm not so narcissistic and I want to get information from the people I work with because I want to be in touch with what's going on, in the world, I keep a real flat structure. So the people, maybe I'm the owner of McDonald's, but I go in there and talk to the workers because I want to know what's going on the field. It's not an ego thing for me. I want to do well. So those flatter structures are not going to be as conducive for narcissism, but these more hierarchies are going to be kind of something exciting for narcissism, again, because of the status and power.
Mm-hmm. So I see the excitement there to the status and power. What is it about the flatter organization that would actually impair a narcissistic leader, or is it just that they're not drawn to it in the first place?
I mean, I don't think you have quite the draw of, getting stuff done. Now, it could be a flat structure that's a really high status flat structure that would be a draw. So you were in the Navy. So if somebody said, like, I want to be a Navy SEAL, I'm a Navy SEAL. I'm like, that's a very high status thing in our culture. And that's a very flat, my understanding, I'm not like a military guy at all, but, in a SEAL group, you got a relatively flat structure in there. There's a hierarchy, but it's sort of flatter there. And I think in that case, you can get your esteem just by being part of the group.
Yeah.
Rather
I
than
see
being
that.
the leader. Like if you're a Navy SEAL, you don't like, I'm not the King SEAL. Like you're just like, dude, you're a SEAL. That's cool enough. I guess SEAL Team 6 would be the coolest, but like that's kind of a little too much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen one of these guys who's, on the extreme of narcissism. And what he would do is he would find places that appeared to have a flat structure. Like he would host things for free and stuff and just kind of be the host and be there. But he would slowly build a hierarchy week over week where he'd start to be sort of promoting people to roles. He would set up spaces that were sort of designated for him as a leader. He always had a mirror on himself. There was always attention on him. He was all of that. He used name tags, cult type tactics, to sort of immediately get people into the whole sphere. The whole thing. And I just saw that as this thing from the outside that looks flat, but I could recognize that he was building the structure.
That's really interesting. And it makes a lot of sense. The other thing, and this is where it gets, narcissism itself is, I'm about ego. It's not necessarily like you could be narcissistic and not like I really am a terrible, evil psychopath. I mean, often we'll talk about malignant narcissism as sort of the more sadistic form. I just want to be that. So not all narcissists want to be evil cult leaders, but the ones that do, one technique you use is you surround yourself with sort of trustworthy, high status people, and you bring them in. And so this happens all the time. Like if I moved up to Virginia, I'm like, I got to start my cult. I'd start making friends with all the popular people, have parties, do all this stuff, get photos with them around my arm, and then I'd get a reputation. And then I'd meet people and they go, well, Keith was hanging out with the guy who owns the horse ranch. He's got to be a good guy. Or I saw him he's got to be a good guy. So it's a tactic for sort of moving yourself into a social milieu or a social circle. And that's how you get people to trust you.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a strategy.
Yeah.
It's hard
amazing
because it works. I mean, the people that are evil can work us because it's how we work.
Yeah. It's amazing how specific the things that you just said there were and how true I've seen them in this man, getting the photos with the arm around people and then making sure it's in the group chat that lots of people in the community are seeing and, all of that. I mean, the whole playbook is already there.
Oh yeah. The name dropping, calling people by like their, you see this with the Hollywood guys, like, me and I'm trying to think who's cool in Hollywood now. I wouldn't even know the Bradster, like Brad Pitt or something, you're trying to build out this idea that you're a trustworthy, high status person. It's just the way you do it.
Yeah. We're talking a little bit about fame too. I mean, what is the connection between narcissism and fame in your understanding?
Fame is a way of getting status and attention and power, and it makes you popular and important. So fame is something that's desirable to people who are narcissistic. It's desirable there's a lot of reasons you want to be famous. You sell more books, or you can, meet a cute girl or whatever, get invited on a Zeppelin. I mean, there's lots of nice reasons to be famous, but some of it's ego. And there was this great study done by Dr. Drew Pinsky, who had the old Loveline show, who's a Hollywood guy, and he knows these guys and an accounting professor at SC named Mark Young. And what they did was at Dr. Drew's show in the green room where the celebrities would sort of wait before coming on, Mark, the professor, would go in there and he'd give out the narcissistic personality inventory to celebrities just to measure great study. I mean, it's unbelievable data. And what you do find is that in the sort of the celebrity world, there's this pull for narcissism. You find more narcissism. But what was cool was the highest level was in things like reality television. So it was fame for its own sake. It wasn't. So I don't know if you've ever hung out. I very rarely hang out with the Hollywood types, but what you'll know with actors and artists is there's a lot of them are very serious. Like they're very talented, very hardworking, they're incredible talents. And there are other people that are sort of celebrities. They don't have talent, but they're interesting to watch, and they end up on reality TV, and then they do silly stuff and they get attention that way. And so I think that path that path of fame, the sort of fame for fame's sake, the Paris Hilton, the Kardashian kind of path. They're very clever people. I'm not trying to, I really think they should get more positive coverage than they do for being so clever. But that path of success is more of a narcissistic path than fame for being a good actor, fame for being a good football player, fame for being a good musician. That's fame. That's the fame is secondary to an actual talent. And so that's not as attractive to narcissism as just fame itself, because fame itself, you don't have to work as much.
Yeah. And Keith, you said that they should get more positive attention for being clever. You seem to see a lot of the bright side on narcissism in general. What do you think that is?
Yeah, but because I developed like the most common measure of entitlement called the psychological entitlement scale, and I never studied it because I don't really like entitled people. just entitlement bothers me. So I'm not like a perfect scientist. I just personally, with grandiose narcissism, I see the bright sides and the dark side. So in the case of the Kardashians, I remember teaching a class. One of the students was looking at her phone. This is many years ago. And I was like, what are you looking at? And it was a Kardashian or one of those people, maybe it was one of the family people was driving around a Ferrari in LA, filming herself. And I watched this girl driving a Ferrari poorly in a place a Ferrari should never be driven, some junked out street in LA. And my students were watching it. And I thought, oh my goodness, this woman just disintermediated the entire media system. Meaning there was no producer, there's no writer's room, there's no this, there's no residuals. She just went straight to the people. And I'm like, oh my God, she just disrupted the entire, like Hollywood's gone. Like she just took out Hollywood. It was amazing. That's what I mean about respect. Like I look at that, I go, that should be a case study every business school is teaching. But people are like, look at her, she's a little girl. I'm like, she's a little billionaire who just disintermediated your entire studio system. That's what I mean about respect. I respect people who, and people kind of, they're like, and sometimes they're like, you'd talk to, an evil person who's a leader? I'm like, of course. Like I'm interested in people who succeed. Even if they succeed at evil, it's kind of interesting how they do it. So that's where my bias is.
Yeah, fair enough. And so one thing with the evil is that there's a saying, people don't quit jobs, they quit bosses. That it does wear on the people beneath them. How is a follower kind of developed for a narcissistic leader?
So if you imagine that your boss, let's say, is really narcissistic, the boss's goal is to get more status, more fame, more money, and if you're attractive, maybe hit on you. It's just that shallow. So if you have a boss like that, you can kind of fit that role. You can do things that make that boss look good, shine, do their work for them, give them credit, and they might keep you around. But it will be kind of a horrible life because you do all the work and you get none of the credit, and you see your boss get all the credit. So that's one way of doing it. The other way you're doing it is you're just being exploited. You just feel like I'm just being exploited. The boss doesn't care about me. He's going to exploit me till he can get rid of me or replace me. Or you're being a victim of some sort of sexual stuff. And that's just horrific. So the narcissistic bosses, because of the exploitation, that's where I think most of the problem is. I think if you have a narcissistic boss who kind of likes you and sees you as a golden child, it might work for a little while. Like we were talking about earlier, they might take you up the levels a few places. Not if you overshine them. Like you never overshine your narcissistic boss. You always make them look good. And if you can do that, it can work, but it's just exhausting.
Yeah. So if it's exhausting and it takes someone who's going to be willing to kind of put up with these things, what's that personality look like? Do we have something like a big five breakout for the follower of the narcissistic leader?
That's an interesting question. There's a couple ways to think about it. I've never looked at this, so I'm just spitballing here. The kind of the classic way would be, there's a dependent personality type, like dependent personality disorder, which is really low extroversion, somebody who wants to be led. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's really what's going on in these things. I think what's going on is probably somebody that's a little bit narcissistic, and they've got some of those qualities a little bit, and they're like, well, this is my chance to get ahead. I've got to attach myself to somebody to move through this system. This is a person I can kind of do stuff for them, and they can help me get through the system. It's risky because I know they might turn on me at some point, or they might do something unethical and it might fall back on me, but it might be a way through the system for me.
Yeah.
So in that case, big five, it would be high conscientiousness, low agreeableness, probably higher extroversion, but probably the lower agreeableness piece.
Mm-hmm. And neuroticism? No?
I wouldn't make a prediction necessarily either way with neuroticism. Maybe low, just because you can handle a narcissistic boss. If you have lower neuroticism, they won't rock you as much. But I think it'd be more. I'm trying to think. I just don't know. It'd probably be somebody that's a little more on the narcissism side than on the dependent side, but it could be both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With the one who really stands out in my memory, what I've seen him do is collect usually women around him, and then he is using them to make himself look good. But then he's also shining a light on them just by virtue of them being in places, and he'll buy them things, make sure that they get to go places, go on trips, meet people, get in photographs. That's a huge part of it. Videos, that kind of thing. And that seems to work consistently.
So they're getting a little narcissism from it.
Yeah.
Like he's got the limelight on him, but he's spilling a little of the limelight out to other people.
Mm-hmm.
That's good leadership. It's not. But that's so. But their motivation is they're like, I'm getting a taste of the sugar. I'm getting a taste of it, and he's got all of it, but I'm getting a little taste, and I enjoy it.
Yes. Yeah. And he paints a picture of such incredible certainty. He claims to know things and ways and stuff that are just beyond the reach of other people. And so people get stunned by how amazing and brilliant and visionary he must be. And so they want to kind of hop on the train and see where it's going.
Yeah. Confidence is such a thing because people are, you said earlier, everyone right now is kind of chaotic. I mean, the world's chaotic. People don't know what's real, but it's not. So confidence right now, if you can project like, I know what's going on, that's going to be really attractive to people. And people believe it. Yes. Like if you go out there and just say, I know what it is, people will fall. They'll kind of fall in line with that confidence. It's very dangerous. The AI models do this all the time. They give you this very confident feedback. They're designed to do that, and they're making people crazy because they're like, you're confidently, and you're like, you say something insane, and they're like, this is 100% right. You're a genius. Yeah. So confidence really works.
Yeah. Something we talked about last year when we talked too is attraction. And you cited a really interesting study about how narcissists could make themselves appear more attractive. And then if you kind of stripped away the makeup and the facial hair and the flashy clothes, they're kind of like everybody else.
Yeah.
How important do you think attraction is in narcissistic leadership?
Oh, I think it's very important. You don't have to be a dandy as a leader. If you have enough social power, you don't have to be really good looking. You can just kind of do it. But when you start looking at how these variables go together, it's like being high in status, being powerful, being attractive. Those are all going to start to sort of merge together. So there'll be a push to be attractive when you get to the top. It's funny looking at U.S. presidents that one of the most narcissistic presidents was Chester Arthur. And no one even remembers who he was, but his nickname was like Gentleman Chester or something because he was so into clothes. So you do see some of that with leadership. And I'm like sort of thinking about it right now, trying to think of leaders that that have really gotten into clothes. And it's hard because not a lot's coming to mind because we went through this whole tech boom where the leaders look like schlubs for like a decade. And it was so annoying. It's like, dude, you're a billionaire. Get the frickin' hoodie off and go buy the fancy French stuff. You know, you're not one of us. That's cool. But so we moved away from the fancy dress and rich guys, but I think it will come back. That's my guess. Yeah. It should.
Yeah. What else have you seen change over 30 years of studying narcissism that stands out?
God. I mean, 30 years ago, we didn't take pictures of ourselves and share them with our friends. And if we did, people would think that was insane.
Yeah.
Taking, like any guy taking a picture of himself is just such a weird idea. When I grew up, it was just bizarre, which is why I always joke to my students. That's why guys always have pictures holding fish on the dating apps, because the only time a guy would take a picture is when they had a fish or a dead buck. That's it. Like, what else? Oh, come on. So what happened was I started studying narcissism. There was this school shooting at Columbine, and I thought, well, that was a really interesting thing that started, and I thought those would go away actually after 9/11, and they didn't, and I think there's reasons for that are bigger than narcissism. Then we started seeing the internet take off, and we started noticing the first people putting up social media pages were narcissistic. Then we had social media, started noticing the people that were using social media were a little more narcissistic, and that was a lot of the drivers of social media. And then we had the economic crisis where we were just handing out free money and everybody getting rich, which is really easy when money's free, once you understand how money works. And so we had all this. I mean, that's why we wrote the Narcissism epidemic. It was just this massive cultural shift, everything in the direction of individualism, self-focus, self is the center of meaning, and narcissism. And in the short term, it feels really good and people get energized. In the long term, you realize you have nothing, because if your source of meaning is yourself, you end up with nihilism and kind of emptiness and despair, sort of existential crises everywhere. So I think that kind of happened.
This sounds like it would be connected to the school shooting part, which you started to veer off on a little bit. Would you like to say more about that?
I don't know, because I get a little weird with some of the stuff, and some of these school shootings just don't feel like the old narcissism ego stuff. They feel like there's something else going on that I don't quite understand it. It's not the same model. It's more weird. It's more, it's just it's a different process than I understand. I'll just put it that way. It's more like strange than just, I'm going to show everybody what it, so like the shooting, one of the shootings, actually, one of the stories I started in the New Signs of Narcissism was a shooting by a young man named Elliot Ness down at UC Santa Barbara, which is a place called Isla Vista in southern, one of the most beautiful places in Southern California. And he went on this, sort of spree killing because he felt he was rejected and girls didn't like him, and hurt his feelings that other guys had girls like him. And so he wanted to show people who an alpha male was. And in his model, getting a gun and shooting people was an alpha male. It's not. Don't do that. It does not make you an alpha male. But that's what was going on. Sort of a more vulnerable narcissist who felt rejected, felt he needed to sort of push himself into the world in a masculine way, bought a Glock, put it in his safe. And he talks about, like, I put it in my safe and I felt, this power, and then went out and shot people. So that's a very narcissistic kind of school shooting. Other ones we're seeing are just weird. It's not a clear case of rejection. It's just odd. And I mean, there's psychological models. I just don't understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So when you say weird, it's beyond sort of normal psychology. I mean, what you study in the band of generally
it's beyond the band
students.
Of what I study, and it gets to things that are a little more kind of psychologically just sort of discombobulated, a little more delusional. Narcissism is pretty normal. It's like I'm a 10. It's like, dude, you're an 8. But it's within normal,
Yeah.
It's not like I'm full on delusion. But then you get people that are kind of delusional, like there's voices talking to me, and maybe I'm doing this because of aliens or something. Like I don't understand that stuff. I'm not a clinician. That's different. And when I see some of the school shootings now, there's this weird, quality to it that I don't understand because it's not my specialty.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned how a life of narcissism would leave someone sort of empty, alone, things like that. Something that I've been studying up on for another interview is the decline in birth rates around the world.
Yes, it's a disaster.
I wonder what you think about birth rate and narcissism.
The birth rate thing is a really challenging thing because it's global. And so, a lot of the little theories, it's like hard to figure out because it's happening in so many places. To me, it seems like it's downstream of modernity and modern urban capitalistic society. So you have a bunch of individuals in a culture, they grow up, they move to the big city to get the job. So they move to Seoul, Korea, or they move to New York City like my daughter, or they move to London if they're in the UK. They move to the big city and they work. And they have great careers, and then they go, I got to get married, and it's sort of, they're 30, and it just gets hard to put it together, and like half the people don't quite put it all together. So I think that general model of independence in a very individualistic, money and focused society sort of drives those birth rates down. I don't know if it's narcissism per se or just the general societal structure, the individualism, the urban living, the smaller families that are associated with narcissism that's driving the birth rate down, but they seem related. One example I would put out there is the difference between North and South Korea, where on every measure that we would say is important, South Korea is crushing it. My South Korean friends laugh and they go like, yeah, we live in 2050. You guys are living in 2020 and we're 20 years ahead of you. But they're not having children anymore. North Koreans are having, I think, twice as many. I don't know it off the top of my head, but the total fertility rate is about maybe 75% higher in the communist North than in the highly successful, democratic, well-functioning, super awesome South. So that's what I mean. I think there's something about modernity and choice and individualism and discovering yourself and doing what you want that isn't necessarily conducive to having kids. But it's not necessarily, narcissism per se, but it's all those things that go around it about individualism.
Yeah. So not necessarily narcissism, though.
No, because I could, in fact, build a model where I could start saying, the coolest people have like 100 kids. And you're kind of seeing this now with these billionaire types, that they're trying to have 100 kids. And there's a few of them out there you can read about. If you associate having lots of children with high status, what will happen is narcissists will be sort of pushed to reproduce. All you have to do is, you want narcissists to like clean up the environment. And you're just like, people who clean the environment are awesome. We have a trophy for the environment. I mean, look at what Trump will do to get the Nobel Peace Prize. It's like, I'm going to make peace everywhere. I'm going to start a war and make peace just to get the peace prize, because that's the big prize. So that's what you do. You align the narcissism with the goal you want. But generally, I think this very individualistic kind of corporate city, urban society isn't really conducive to having kids. And I think it's a disaster.
Yeah. You did mention Donald Trump. Your chapter on narcissism starts with a paragraph about Donald Trump. You said that your dissertation took some inspiration from Donald Trump on trophy spouses.
Yeah.
What do we think about Donald Trump, leadership, narcissism?
It's really interesting. I don't like talking about Trump because I've done it for 40 frickin' years, and it just gets people so mad. But we do have some interesting research that I think it's worth talking about, and it sort of splits it down the middle. So this was done back when he was running against Hillary Clinton. We had people that were Clinton supporters and Trump supporters rate Donald Trump using a very detailed version of the Big Five that you're talking about. It's sort of the 30 facets of the Big Five, so it's got a lot of detail to it. And then you go, do they see the same person? The people who like Donald Trump and not like Donald Trump see the same person, the same personality structure. And what happens is you find the answer is yes and no. Everybody agrees that Trump is assertive, agentic. He will do things. He has an ego. Like no one thinks Trump doesn't have an ego. But people who support Trump think he's competent. He has some ability to control himself, and he's doing things in the interests of the people of the country, let's say, or of his supporters or whatever. Not saying this is true or not true. I'm just saying that's what people believe. So they go, well, yeah, he's a tough SOB, but he's generally a decent guy doing things for me. I could kind of trust him. The people that voted against him are like, yeah, he's got a bit of an ego, and he's totally out of control, and he has agreeableness of about zero. So they see him as sort of an unsuccessful psychopath. Not even a successful psychopath. It's like the people that support him see him as a successful psychopath, and the people that don't see him as like a broken psychopath. That's kind of the difference. But you get very different viewpoints of the same person because some people support him and some don't.
Yeah. Well, that sounds very similar to what we were talking about earlier, which is, in an organization or something, a narcissistic leader can rise and bring their people along with them, but they're very polarizing, and then other people are paying the price for what is not really leadership for the good of the whole.
Yeah, and that's always been the case with narcissistic leaders, is they tend to be very polarizing. And when we've studied U.S. presidents using sort of the personality estimates, we find that narcissistic leaders get a lot done. I mean, they're very popular. They're very effective. I mean, you're talking about Lyndon Johnson, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson, Bill Clinton. You got a pretty good list to choose from. There's a lot of others. And they get stuff done. They're popular. They're kind of sketchy, bad people in retrospect too. It's always a mixed blessing with narcissism. You go, well, was LBJ a good guy? Well, people like Medicare. They go, that's pretty good. The other stuff, like Vietnam, was kind of bad. I don't know. It's mixed bag. And then you ask people, you go, well, who were the really good people that were president? Who are the people you think were good humans? And they go, well, maybe Jimmy Carter. Okay. Did anyone like him as president? No. He was a terrible president. One term, people couldn't stand him because he was a good guy. And he told the truth, and he tried to be honest with people. And he's like, turn down your thermostats, wear a sweater. And they're like, we're Americans. We're not wearing sweaters. Screw you. So it gets really complicated with leadership, where people feel comfortable sometimes with narcissistic leaders because of the confidence, because of the energy, because of the assertiveness, but they can do real damage too.
Yeah. So I know that you have a Jungian interest, which we've talked about a little bit in the past.
Yeah.
What would be some archetypes of a good leader, or some archetypal energy that leaders could tap into?
That's interesting. I think there's a couple things that pop into my mind when you ask about Jung and sort of narcissism and leadership. And Jung's ideas of narcissism were kind of complicated, in that, at least in his, and it wasn't like he had a ton of writings on it, but in some writings, he argued that narcissism was the solution to narcissism was narcissism in a way. That he almost argued that self-love was the solution, that in some respect. He had a very interesting view. But in terms of leadership, in a Jungian system, I'd say the big risk, kind of the red flag for narcissism, in leadership is when you start identifying with what Jung called your capital S self, sort of the center of your collective unconscious, your Godhead, what would be the word? The Godhead inside you, whatever it is. And so this would be a problem with leaders, especially in spiritual communities or religious communities, where they start to say, oh, I'm sort of in this communion with the divine. I am the divine. And they become messianic and sort of, grandiose. It's sort of the spiritual inflation or ego inflation. So that would be a risk that Jung would talk about. So don't identify with your higher self necessarily. Find a relationship with it. I think the other model that Jung would talk about that would be important for leadership would be, well, two things. One is just the whole process of psychological growth and individuation, which we talk about mostly with the hero's journey, which was an idea from Joseph Campbell, who was a kind of a Jungian mythologist. But the hero, well, it actually comes from Otto Rank, he's the first one to talk about the hero's journey. But the hero's journey is this process of becoming yourself, but there is a process of loss and descent in that process. You don't sort of start here and become a leader without descending into something and working your way back up. That's sort of the Jungian model. So Jesus Jesus doesn't become the Christ until he dies and is resurrected. I mean, there's a process to become. Harry Potter has to descend into hell, before he can become the guy he's meant to be. Jonah has to go in the belly of the whale. So there is that kind of Jungian, there's a descent process in psychological growth. And if you don't do that, I think it's easier to become ego inflated. The other thing from Jungian world that I think is interesting in leadership is mentorship. So a lot of times in the hero's journey, they talk about finding a mentor. But when you turn it around, what they're talking about is in terms of psychological development, you sort of reach this period of generativity. I mean, talk about it, Erickson talked about his generativity, maybe age 40s, 50s, maybe my age. You start going, I want to bring up the next generation. My ego gets turned down. And what brings me joy is bringing up the next bringing up the kids, basically, like I've done enough. Let's bring up the next generation. So I think that transition into mentorship is really important. One thing Jung talked about was the midlife crisis. He kind of made this idea up. And what he said happened was men became more feminine in middle of life. It was like a night sea journey. So you start off, you're a warrior, you're building stuff. It's my career. You're building your career, you get your family, you do your stuff, you hit your 40s, you've done all that stuff. And now you got to do the inner work because you've been out there doing the external work your whole life. And now you start looking inside and it becomes a transition. And so men become more feminine in a way. They become more about mentoring, more about caring, more about, I want the system to outlast me. Like, what do I care? I'm fucking almost 60. Like I did enough. I care about the system more. So that transition is really important. And if you don't make that transition, what happens? You're a 67-year-old guy trying to be a 30-year-old dude. You're kind of playing the same play you've been playing your whole life. You're becoming empty. And when you die, no one's going to be around you because you just played the game too long. I don't know if that made any sense. You asked me, I just went for it.
Oh, I'm so glad. So there seems maybe a contradiction in the bit about the midlife crisis, which is that it sounds like it's a process to eventually let go of the self-orientedness and to look outward. But at the same time, what we call in culture a midlife crisis might look very narcissistic. There's the image of like the guy who gets divorced and gets the red convertible.
Yeah, that's the failed midlife crisis. He failed the test. Yeah, he failed. He hit midlife and he's like, okay, now it's time to make that transition. You made it this far. Now you got to become a wise man. Now you got to do the inner work. Now you got to become a mentor. You want to be somebody people follow. And guys like, dude, I don't want to do that. I want to hold on to my youth. I'm going to start dating a 20-year-old and get a Porsche. That's a loser. I mean, I don't say I'm not. My friends are fine. But I'm just saying that's sort of like you failed. That's like, you failed the test. You're like, I'm just going to go back and be a baby again. I'm going to go back and be a 20-year-old. That's easy for me. That's like when you're becoming a 20-year-old and you're like, I don't want to do this. I want to go be a child again and live in my mom's basement. Same thing. Guy getting a Porsche at 40 is just like a 20-year-old living in his mom's basement. Same deal. You're just becoming immature. So I think that would be the failed midlife crisis. And I should say, with women, Jung's idea was it went the other way, that women would spend the early part being more nurturing and then become more masculine in midlife and become more interested in sort of worldly pursuits, careers, etc. Very interesting.
Huh. Is that a turn more toward the self? More of an ego?
It would be more towards the external world. So it would be a little bit more towards the self. Yeah.
Okay. What would be the archetype for that feminine transition?
Maiden, mother, crone. Is that how that's the classic Jungian? You start as a maiden, then you become a mother, and then you become a crone. Crone doesn't sound good these days. A wise woman might be a better word.
Yeah, high priestess.
Yeah, high priestess. Yeah, crone doesn't sound. I know Jung used that word because that's the first time I had to look it up in a dictionary. It was probably in the 80s reading Jung. And the guy would be, what's the male version of that? Sort of a something king magician or sage. Yeah, but I forget what the first step would be to a sage. So I think that's the transition where you become somebody who's wise and useful for all of society. You know, you're not just doing it for your own ego because you've done enough. You're kind of being you're a benefactor for society, being a wise person.
Yeah. So for a narcissistic person, a highly narcissistic person, it seems there would be roadblocks. Would it be possible? What would be things that could make it possible?
I think the challenge is giving up that, this is what happens with narcissism and age is people don't want to give up that youthfulness and they want to hold on. We're talking about holding on to the Porsche, and people are like, if you wake up and go, how can I help other people? That's different than waking up and going, how can I crush it today and get more attention? So I think with narcissism, there has to be a bit of a transition. That said, there are people who are, I see in the world, who are very narcissistic, and they get older and they go, you know what, I've got to impart some lessons for the next generation. They're very good lessons. Because they're narcissistic, they're good at doing the imparting part. They're good at the media and stuff. And so I can see, I see this, people who are very narcissistic, have a lot of self-awareness about it, are able to still do things that are very pro-social and help the next generation. And they get adulation and attention and stuff for it as well. So I think the key in a lot of this is if you're narcissistic and you want to do good things, you need those good things to line up with getting attention or status or admiration from society.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot about the internal. Now that we're talking about society too, are there cultural differences in narcissism? What cultures are more or less narcissistic?
Yeah, it's such a interesting question. So my original thought has been that modern sort of very choice-based, capitalistic, urban, socially isolated, big city culture would sort of pull for narcissism. And there is evidence for that. But we also see in some of the international studies that cultures that are more, clannish is a word they use, more tribal, a little more like groupish than individualistic, become very low trust societies. And in low trust societies, sometimes narcissism is really effective as well. So you can find these individualistic European societies that aren't pulling for narcissism as much as maybe a lower trust Eastern European society, because you need to be tough in a lower trust society, and that pulls for narcissism in a little different way. So I think the answer's a little complicated. Then there is a paper that just came out, and they did a national study. Now, I've done this before, and I never publish, which cultures were the most narcissistic or not, because they don't like name pointing from single samples, but they probably had bigger samples. And they argued that the highest narcissism was found in mainland China in these data. Yeah, I said the same thing with my face. And
in a country run by the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, it's very, I mean, it was very interesting, but and the problem with doing this work is you're trying to estimate the same psychological construct, and in this case, narcissism. You're trying to estimate it in all these different cultures using self-report measures in different languages. So what happens is you're taking a scale, you're translating into Chinese, you're translating into Turkish, into Spanish, into, whatever, Swahili. And when you're doing that, you're not necessarily sure you're measuring the same thing that you're measuring, let's say, in the English sample. So this kind of work is technically, it's just very challenging to do. And they use a lot of a lot of statistical quantitative things to try to measure, to balance all that out, but it's very hard to do. So my answer to your question is what I gave you, but I want to say it's hard to answer this question because it's hard to know if what I measure as narcissism in Georgia is the same as it is in Tokyo.
Yeah. And the instinct there is that a society of communists would be lower in narcissism, that there would be sort of more of a sense of national
I would never
unity.
I would never call China communist. I was there when it was communist in the 80s. So it's like the first, one of the first Americans over after they opened for some reason. And it was very different. It's now a very capitalistic, kind of hyper-capitalistic place. But I think what you're suggesting there is, God, Keith, it sounds to me like individualistic societies would have more individualistic people and you'd find more narcissism.
Yeah.
And more collectivistic or Confucian societies would have more collectivistic individuals or interdependent individuals, and they would have less narcissism. For example, California, where everybody's kind of into doing what they want to do, people are kind of independent-minded, you'd see a lot of narcissism. You go to Japan, people are more cooperative and collectivistic, more interdependent in how their self is, and you'd find lower narcissism. And that is the argument you would probably make. I think that's the argument you were trying to make.
Thank you for putting it so much better, though.
Well,
I'm sort of chewing on this as we go.
That makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're saying, does the culture at this level match up with the individual personalities at this level? And you think it should. So that's the way it should work. The question then is, you're asking is, how could you have so much narcissism in China if China is a very cooperative, collectivistic, Confucian society? It shouldn't allow for that much narcissism. And I could give you an answer, which is, it had to do with the little emperor syndrome and multiple generations of the one-child policy and urbanization. And I could come up with that argument, but I don't know if it's true or not. I might cite a couple papers, but I don't know if that's true. I'm just, I haven't been to China a long time. I don't know.
Yeah. And
so I'm one of those people that thinks I have to experience things to really have a strong opinion.
Well, that shows too. I mean, and especially with your topic and all of your experience, there are a lot of things where you could just declare this is it. But you're more nuanced.
Yeah, I try to be. I've been wrong a lot in the past.
Anything come to mind?
Dude, like I said, I really thought, here's what I thought would happen to America is they pumped all this ego into kids, especially the millennials. They destroyed the economy, clown show. That's not my expertise, but it's not that hard to see what they did. So what I was wondering is, you told all these kids you're awesome, you had self-esteem movement, all these millennials are awesome. You've destroyed the economy, so they're not going to be living the dream. What are you going to do? My thought was, if I were running the show, I would move everybody online. I'd give them, you're the grand wizard. I shouldn't say that's probably a KKK. You're the grand master of some guild in World of Warcraft. You're the Dragon Lord or some stuff. And then everybody would feel good about themselves because they're like, yeah, I've got high status. I'm a wizard guild person in the world. That's what I thought. I thought it was, and then I saw the movie Ready Player One. I'm like, darn it, they already figured it out. That's the plan. So I thought this made perfect sense. Everybody would be happy. They didn't do that plan. Instead, they just told everybody that they sucked and they broke everybody in pieces. And now everybody's miserable, and you got 20% of women on SSRIs, and the culture's in chaos, and people aren't having children anymore. And narcissism started going down, and millennials feel, and I think they feel, I don't know, like they don't have a chance. I think they feel a little bit hopeless when I talk to them, and they feel like things are not fair. How come I can't have a house? And I'm like, well, I don't know. You could talk to the Fed. They kind of the ones who messed up the interest rates. I don't know. So I think I was just totally wrong. I thought things would be pretty good right now. I don't know. I mean, I was in Russia, 1990, let's say 91, ruble collapse. I'm in a basement watching, eating caribou meat, the plane's down. If I'm in Petropavlovsk, I'm going to get arrested. So I'm in this Dachau eating caribou, watching American TV pumped in, and it's Dallas and the show Santa Barbara. And I realized, I'm like, God, our psychological operations are so good in the U.S. These poor Russians are sitting there freezing, eating caribou meat, which isn't very tasty. No offense to, I mean, I've had good caribou, but this isn't great. They're watching America going, oh my God, I should be in America. The guys have big hats and beautiful people and cattle and stuff. And who shot JR? I'm like, what a great psyop. I mean, we crushed them. It was wonderful. And then we changed our psyop. We just started making people depressed and destroying ourselves. I know why we did it psychologically. This all goes back to MK Ultra and how you change people, and it's just not how I would have done it. So I'm getting a little off the reservation here. I apologize. But that's I was quite very wrong about it. I thought people would be happier now.
Yeah. And you're saying why we did it, and so change the psyop onto the American population?
Yes, that's why I'm a little bit crazy, because I don't know exactly how these decisions are made, but they're made. I mean, people are making these decisions, how you run a country, how you run the psychology of a country, how you run education, how you do these things. These are decisions that were made. Like the self-esteem movement was a decision a bunch of people made. We're going to force self-esteem. So people make these decisions, and I don't know why they do it. They never ask me. But what I mean is that there's sort of strategies we use at sort of governmental levels to run our educational systems that have certain qualities to them, or economic systems. And yeah.
Keith, what role do you think education has in the development of personality and narcissism?
I think education itself, if it's just education and it's focused on actually learning stuff, not so much. It's usually you kind of learn, like in the old days, what we learn is that we were usually good at something and not good at other stuff. And, somebody was good at math and kind of sucked at other things. Another guy was good at, playing football and maybe not so good at math. And everyone was kind of happy. It wasn't a big deal. It was just, that's how it was. And then a group of educators in the 80s in California decided that we needed to start manipulating people's personalities in school by increasing their self-esteem. It's called the California Task Force of Self-Esteem and Social Responsibility. And they decided to use education as a sort of a launching pad to inflate children's egos in the interest of helping society. So that was a plan. And they started using sort of extracurricular techniques in schools to make people feel better about themselves. And they were successful, and self-esteem went up, and it worked. And the only thing they didn't do was make the world any better. So you ended up in a world with a bunch of people with higher self-esteem that had no more success at all. And that's where we are now. So people are doing things. They make decisions. These things get into the popular culture, and it just happens.
Mm-hmm. In the world of education, you've been in higher ed for a long time. You're with the University of Georgia and with the Peterson Academy. What do you think is ahead for education, particularly with adults?
Oh, God, it's so interesting, right? Because, the obvious well, I'll talk about it. I'm at a major SEC football school, as I like to say, University of Georgia. What we're seeing in education is that the number of students has peaked. It peaked a few years ago and it's starting to drop. So there's fewer kids going to college. The value proposition of college has gotten very bad, meaning it doesn't make sense in my mind for most people to borrow $250,000 to go to college and get a degree. It just doesn't make, like, I'd say, yeah, I'd probably better to take $250,000 and buy a house. Like, if you had to guess what's going to get you farther. So what's happened is people are going, college is kind of an expensive scam. But at the same time, it's super competitive because it's still the only way to get into the profession. So if you want to become a banker, a lawyer, a physician, an accountant, or an engineer, you got to go to university. So there's a huge competition. What I've noticed happening is that there's been a huge demand for SEC football schools and public schools because it's half the price and people have more fun at schools. At football schools, they're not as political. So a lot of people, like, we have a lot of New Englanders coming to Georgia now because we're not a bunch of anti-Semitic people. Because, the Georgia kids are like, they're like this. A lot of the kids in Georgia is just we're not really anti-Semitic down here. It's weird. It's just so the kids from New England are like, come down here. At least that's what I've heard. I don't, so there's going to be a huge amount of competition for the few schools left, the same way that in Japan, all the towns are getting abandoned except Tokyo's growing, or in North Korea, Seoul's growing, but the little towns, it's what's happening everywhere, that you sort of get this aggregation. So we're going to lose a lot of universities. The big ones are going to get more competitive, the Ivies, the second string Ivies, and the big state schools. And then we're going to build decentralized education. Because what's happened is I can do research without needing education, and I can get all the education I need without, you can listen to 4,000 hours of podcasts with me, which are about as good as taking my class. I'm not going to go into the details the same way I would, but so we're going to end up with this really decentralized education. I'm just spitballing here. I'm just sorry if it's getting too wandery. What's going to happen is the people in the decentralized education world are going to do a lot better than the people in the centralized education world. Meaning my buddies in the anthropology department are not going to be as popular as Graham Hancock and all the people talking about ancient aliens, right? Because ancient aliens are cool, and learning like real technical anthropology is hard and it's kind of boring, and they're really talented. And so my guess is that where the interest goes is to this decentralized educational sort of network. And you might call it bro science. With medicine, that's already happened, where people are doing all this non-traditional medicine. They're all trading the guys, the peptides and stuff, So people they've decentralized medicine already. I think we're decentralizing education too. And I think it makes sense that that's happening, but at the same time, the big universities are still going to exist. My daughters all went to university, or they're going to go to university. So I don't think it's going away, but I think it's going to be reduced a lot because it doesn't make sense for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I should just say this. Sorry, I did. Just Brad, if any young guys in your audience like, I don't want to go to school, I want to be an electrician. Great. I would just say, go to your football school, major in business, get you work on the side. You don't have to get a bunch of debt because you're at your local football school. Have fun, and then go be an electrician. And you might even like school and want to become an attorney. But I'm not against college. You just don't have to spend $250,000 and just go to someplace local.
Mm-hmm. And how do those experiences compare to something like the Peterson Academy?
What Peterson is doing is, it's very high production value courses delivered online. So what he's able to, like, if I'll do a class for him, and then he puts it out, and then it can scale to, I don't know how many people they have, 30,000, 50,000 people or something. So I can do a course, same way I can do a podcast with you, and I could have 50,000 people listen to that. It's amazing. I teach a big lecture hall with 300 kids, and they don't even come. So I'm mostly talking to like 100 kids. Yeah. So that's you get what you're trading is you're trading scale for sort of intimacy or depth or whatever. And so Peterson's really good at scale, and what they're trying to do is use very high production value to try to make it as good as you can with that amount of scale. So I like working with them because they're just good to work with. I mean, just good people, they're very high quality professional video people. And
the production looks excellent. And
you're in this
what
business,
is their economic game?
I don't know it. I mean, I don't really know what their whole plan is. And probably if they told me, they'd make me sign an NDA anyway.
Okay.
But my guess is it's, you build out content and then you try to scale it and sell it. I don't know if there's another, like beyond that, I don't know if they have another secret plan or anything.
Got it. Yeah. Well, Keith Campbell, while we're talking about things online, before we get to our last topic, where's the best place for people to look for you online?
I really don't like the whole yelling at people on X. I'm on there, but I don't really do much. I do write a Substack called Explorations in Personality, which I do enjoy doing because I don't get people saying you suck, for everything I write, and I can think about it a little more. So my Substack is where I put most of my energy, and then my website, wkeithcampbell.com, if you want to find links to any, books, podcasts, any of that stuff.
Great. We'll put some links in the description for people to check out. And our last topic is really the practical of leadership, narcissists and leadership, kind of the nuts and bolts. Just in general, first, I wonder, we've talked about percentages in the past, 2% of people or maybe narcissistic personality disorder, things like that. With leaders, I mean, what are we thinking?
Dude, that's a great question, because what you're asking is it's a selected group. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking at the high level of leadership, and then your question is what kind of leadership? Is it local community leadership? Are you talking about like corporate leadership, military leadership, political leadership? My guess is you're getting a higher representation of narcissism than you would in the general population, but I don't think I could give you a percentage.
Yeah. But higher. It's got to be higher.
Yeah, it's just it's a draw. So like there was a big study in out of the UK and the National Health Service. And you can compare surgeons versus, general practitioners in medicine. And the surgeons are more narcissistic. And I love my surgeon friends, and there's a reason for that. It's a higher status thing, though, is part of it. And that's going to draw people. And that's what leadership is. It's just going to be a pull for people who are narcissistic. I like leadership. If somebody's like, Keith, you want to go run this? I'll run anything. If somebody said, hey, you want to run I'd run anything. But I don't care that much, so I'm not fighting to get the job. That's where the narcissism comes in. Like, you have to really want it to push for it. And so you have to have that motivation. So I think you're going to have overrepresentation. Same way if you're going out to a bar to meet a guy at midnight on Saturday night, you're going to find a little more narcissism than you will if you're trying to meet him at church on Sunday morning. Yeah, it's just where you're pulling the people.
Yeah. And what do you think can be done to find and select for good leaders? The challenge is that,
and we looked at some of the leadership assessment centers, and they were actually pulling for narcissism a little bit, or selecting for narcissism a little bit, because I need somebody who's confident, can make a decision under pressure, blah, blah, blah. So it's a hard thing to do. So my sense is you need to give people a lot of time and sort of watch them historically over time, and then you'll start to see the dishonesty, you'll see the ethical problems, and you try to weed them out early along the process. When people are rising to leadership very quickly, we call this emergent leadership. When that happens, you're going to get a lot more narcissism, because you're not going to be able to sort of select for people as, it's not going to happen as slowly. So I imagine in a more traditional environment, like, say, Catholic Church, like been around for, I don't even know, I don't even know where they start the church. Maybe they started with Peter. They probably do. They have a very structured hierarchy. So like, narcissism isn't just going to rush to the top. Like if there's like a new pope, I'm not like, yeah, there's another narcissistic pope. I mean, they get kind of pushed through a lot of these things. So you probably got some ego, but it's not as much as you would maybe in a U.S. Popularity contest political campaign, where you've got to be narcissistic, and that's going to help you win. Does that make sense? Like in Europe, where they have a parliamentary, or like parliaments, and they kind of select leaders, you don't get as much narcissism at top. But if you run for leadership and you're selected by a popularity contest, you're going to get more narcissism, because you're kind of being picked as a celebrity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And last of all, in your book, you describe the concept of a servant leader. What does that leader look like? Maybe it's something that we could all kind of be more aware of.
This is an old idea in the business literature, but it's the idea of a leader who's primarily looking out for his people, he's a good king, if she's a good queen, she's looking out for her people. So that kind of leadership, where your job is to make everyone perform at their best and protect them from the kind of the crap that comes down from the top. They call it umbrella leaders. I think that servant leadership is a really good model, but what you're sacrificing when you get a lot of loyalty when you run as a servant leader, but you don't get as much fame or as attention, so your career might not do as well. That's kind of the trade-off. Narcissism kind of works in leadership, but it's up and down. It's really risky.
Yeah. Well, Dr. W. Keith Campbell, for bringing that nuance to this topic, for your book, The New Science of Narcissism, and for taking this interview with me, thank you so much.
Oh, Brad, thanks. What a pleasure.
Thanks for watching my interview with Professor W. Keith Campbell. To go even deeper on these ideas, you can watch our previous interview on narcissists in romantic relationships. Links to that interview and everything else we discussed are in the description.